smarter with the help of our leadoff panel. My homegirl, my one and only, Westchester's favorite daughter, Ali Vitale, MS Now senior Capitol Hill correspondent, but you know her as the host of Way Too Early, joins us. Lisa Rubin, MS Now senior legal reporter, and Sam Stein, managing editor for The Bulwark and MS Now political contributor. And we're going to hope Sam does an okay job, but compared to these two ladies, it's not likely. Lisa, I don't even understand what this means. Explain. Shocking.
Steph, this ruling is a hard one to explain, too, because what the Supreme Court did yesterday, and you described it really well, is basically saying to the states, you're not injured enough for us to take action yet. And on the other side of it, this is like a bad boyfriend judicially gaslighting you. They say that the administration itself would suffer irreparable harm if they're not allowed to implement this executive order. They say reversal of the district court's judgment would come too late for the 2026 midterms, so that the district court's error deals a serious setback to the executive's goals while this litigation unfolds. Let's unpack that. The president's policy goals are more important to this court than the damage that's already been done to state and local election officials who are trying to anticipate exactly how to administer this election amidst this uncertainty. And you're correct. The president has directed the United States Postal Service through this executive order to essentially create lists of pre-approved voters who are entitled to get mail-in ballots.
And that's going to happen in the next 10 weeks? Just explain to us. They make this decision, and now technically, what happens?
So right now, they cannot actually force states to return those lists. And that's because in a totally separate litigation, a court has blocked the United States Postal Service from going forward with that regulation. However, late last night, the Department of Justice took this Supreme Court opinion,
of course
sent it to that district court judge and said, look at what the Supreme Court did. You should immediately vacate your order or give us a stay pending appeal, because the Supreme Court has said that the administration's objectives here are more important than any quote unquote speculative injury that the states are suffering in trying to anticipate exactly what to do with the election, as you noted, 10 weeks away.
Sam Stein, a bad boyfriend judicially gaslighting you is like an unwritten Taylor Swift song that we're waiting for in her next album. I said that for Ali Vitale.
Thank you.
What do you make of this?
Well, now I'm trying to imagine the lyrics to the Taylor Swift song. So you threw me off a little bit. Look, I'm of two minds. One is it's a ominous ruling for the reasons that Lisa articulated. Obviously, it would, if allowed to go into effect, it would cause incredible chaos. The idea that the Postal Service would have this much say over who gets a ballot seems to fly in the face of the Constitution, of federalism, of conservatism. And the Supreme Court allowing this to happen also seems to fly in the face of the stated Purcell principle that they don't want to get too involved in election matters this close to an election. So obviously chaotic, alarming, all the adjectives you want. On the other hand, I want to breathe a little bit. There is a second injunction still in place. There is the likelihood, although you never know with this court, that on the merits, they will look at this and say, no, this is flimsy on the constitutional grounds. This doesn't make any sense. Why would the U.S. Postal Service have this much authority over our voting system? This doesn't, fly. And ultimately, the longer that this litigation and the second injunction, and there are other cases actually involving this, as that continues to progress and the closer we get to the election, it does seem likely, and Lisa could correct me if I'm wrong, it does seem likely that the court will ultimately say, yeah, this is just too close. States are already sending out ballots. We can't get too involved like this at this juncture. Now, I will just say there is one other nightmare scenario, which is that the rule does go into effect ultimately because they need to ripen the cases. There needs to be damage and standing. And then the court turns around and says, actually, we can't now interfere in undoing the rule because we're too close to the election. Even if that rule went into effect for a mere day, it is now in effect, and the Purcell principle does apply here, and we cannot undo it. That's the nightmare scenario, but I don't think that's particularly likely.
Ali, do actual Republicans that are running for office want this, right? Everybody loves to say, Trump votes by mail. He does. But so do a whole lot of other people. I don't know, senior citizens in Florida and people across this country. Is this definitely, I know Trump loves control, But take me to Republicans in these very important states. Do they want this?
Yeah, this is actually one of the things that has driven me crazy about this curtailing vote by mail push, because it is a successful voting method for Republicans to reach their voters and get them to return their ballots. I mean, a lot of people vote by mail. I know that in 2020, the word was, well, Democrats impacted by COVID are voting by mail, and that's how they're accessing the ballot. Sure, that's true. But so were Republicans. And for years, Republican operatives have done a great job of making sure that their machine to get ballots back worked very well on vote by mail. So there are those Republican operatives that I talk to who say, yeah, this is not exactly helping us. I think, for example, of a place like Alaska, very rural state. A lot of people vote by mail. There is a marquee Senate race that is happening there, Dan Sullivan versus Mary Peltola, that is going to rely heavily on Republican voters returning their mail-in ballots. I'm not saying that there's a direct correlation between what the executive order is doing and that, but there might be. And so I think there's that piece of it, too. But when I think about the fact that for Republicans playing politics, they have to go along with what the administration is saying on this, because it is so wrapped up in their larger agenda of secure elections, even though elections are secure. And of course, their dubious connections that they like to make between undocumented immigrants accessing the ballot box, which again is not happening, and certainly not happening in the staggering vote changing numbers that Republicans like to say they are. And so the politics of it cuts very crosswise with what is actually probably good politicking and actually winning elections.
While the courts are playing politics, you mentioned it in your first answer, we are watching this court be more and more differential to the president's policy choices. We just saw that, right? Trump's going to be able to continue building this ballroom.
For right now, he is, and particularly because of Chief Justice Roberts making a decision in a one-sentence order last week, just basically saying, yeah, you can continue to do this. Steph, everything you need to know about yesterday's Supreme Court decision, you could see in like the first page. They say that this executive order was designed to maintain public confidence in federal elections. So I'll go back to my Taylor Swift gaslighting us sort of analogy. Designed to maintain public confidence in federal elections. The only reason people have lost confidence in federal elections is because Donald Trump has falsely been serving the narrative up for at least 6 years and likely longer than that, that there is something fundamentally wrong with our elections. But I want to say one other thing, which is don't sleep on what he can do now. So Sam mentioned
He being Trump.
He being Trump.
Tell us.
Okay, so there are two provisions of this executive order that he can implement now. One empowers the Department of Homeland Security to prepare and send to states lists of citizens. The second part says to DOJ, you should prioritize the investigation and prosecution of local and state election officials who give ballots to non-citizens. In their decision yesterday, the Supreme Court says neither of these things force the states to do anything. Neither of them impact the states or put any harm on them. And Justice Sotomayor in a dissent sort of unpacks this and says, that's not true. You have to understand these two things together and not separately. By giving the states list of citizens and telling DOJ prioritize the prosecution of people who give ballots to those unauthorized to vote, they're essentially trying to force into the hands of state and local election officials a tool by which they should compare people who are eligible to vote against lists of people who are citizens, so that they can then say, if somebody gives a ballot to someone who is a non-citizen, hey, look, you had the right and the opportunity to figure out who was entitled to vote, and you didn't do it. You were reckless. You should be prosecuted. And that, Justice Sotomayor says, that is, in fact, imminent harm to the states and localities that should have resulted in the court making a different decision here. Think about how that chills state and local elected officials, but also think about what happens when we put a state citizenship list in the hands of a red state with blue cities in them with high immigrant populations. What are they going to do with those lists? What's the likelihood that people who are in fact citizens, who share names, for example, with people who aren't citizens, show up at the polls and are told in some of those states, oh, I'm sorry, you're not entitled to vote here. That is the design, and that I would predict to you, unless this is stopped, that will in fact happen in November.
Okay, Sam Stein, is there a chance, though, that moves this dramatic, that give the president this much power, that it's going to backfire on him, right? I take you back to the No Kings rallies, where tons of Americans who do not have political affiliations got out and stood up and said, no, we do not operate that way. We have three separate but equal branches of government. And more we hear that American voters who don't like either party care about affordability and accountability. And by accountability, this is what I'm talking about. Is there a chance that the American people are going to see all this chaos and say, I'm showing up to vote and I'm voting against this?
Oh, yeah. I think there's a really high chance of that. I think already there's been incredible motivation among Democrats and progressives over, for instance, the Supreme Court's decisions around the Voting Rights Act. You're seeing black turnout, for instance, skyrocket around that. Obviously, Trump's numbers are in the toilet, including on immigration. And so if you see selective enforcement and false positives when it comes to names, it's very obvious that it's going to hit Republicans, it's going to hit people who are independent, it's going to hit Democrats, and they're going to be outraged by it. That seems pretty obvious to me. And then you also have to factor in that already Republicans are dealing with an enthusiasm problem. And so if you add on hurdles to go vote, it's going to hamper them even further, whereas Democrats look like they're at this juncture willing to crawl over broken glass to go and get to the polls. That said, part of this whole episode, that what the Trump administration is doing is not just to necessarily hamper with the vote or to try to lessen the amount of Democrats who could go to the polls. It's to create the predicate for after the election, if it doesn't go their way, to say, hey, look, we tried to put in these rules. We tried to make the voter rolls clean. We want voter ID. And if we didn't get everything legally from the Supreme Court, then you can't inherently trust this outcome. And therefore, maybe we shouldn't seat some of these lawmakers. Maybe Mike Johnson, who will still be Speaker at the time, should hold open those seats because we just don't know for certain if people voted illegally. And I think that's the other element here, which is the post-election shenanigans and the problems that are going to rise after that, which we can't really conceive of in full yet, but this does create the predicate for that type of stuff.